Hi folks, you're with Tacitus Today at your Pushback channel. In this essay we will ask, can modern democracy survive? The policies of globalization putting democracy under deadly pressure. Was democracy ever designed to work with universal voting rights? Should democracy be protected or taken out back and quietly euthanized? And how was modern democracy formed, and does it contain the seeds of its own destruction? Throughout history, major wars and their unpredictable outcomes, their unexpected and unanticipated consequences have unleashed a panoply of random events, often of cataclysmic magnitude. They have changed borders and landscapes, entire societies, changed how people relate to one another and to the body politic. Wars have advanced technology within a compressed time frame to previously unimagined heights, redefined cherished beliefs and expectations, and have also redefined civic membership, its responsibilities, its rewards, its values and obligations. No greater example of this axiom exists than the total wars of the early 20th century. The most advanced industrial economies of the globe twice engaged in a titanic struggle for ascendancy, mobilising every social, economic and material resource at their disposal. Participation and sacrifice was demanded by law of every citizen. Never before had war been engaged on such a scale, and never before was every citizen, young, old, male and female, rich and poor, drawn directly into the total war struggle. The legacy of these wars and the mass involvement of the citizenry first gave us universal male franchise, followed by voting for women, and then Western social democratic welfare state. Nonetheless, to understand the status of democracy in Western democratic states of today, we must come to grips with modern democratic principles and practices, a process which began in the late 1700s. In Britain, males over the age of 21 first received the vote in 1918, almost 100 years ago, as well as some married women over the age of 30, and all women had received the vote over the age of 21 by 1928. It was 1970 before citizens aged 18 and over also received a vote. Yet, universal franchise is a modern democratic phenomenon, one that, like total war, was never foreseen by the great political thinkers and philosophers of recorded history. Even today, the consequences and ramifications of everyone having the vote, universal franchise, are still unfolding. Crucially, the advent of extended and then universal franchise began separating the fundamental concepts of civic duty and pursuant obligations of the citizen to the civis. The vote was historically granted based on a stake one had in society, the responsibilities that one accepted, and the level of contribution to society. This contract of duty, obligation and responsibility gradually gave way and was ultimately replaced by valuing the sacrifices a citizen had made and may be required to make, such as in the case of total industrial war. Never before had citizens been required to make such sacrifices, such as those required by total war, for such a sustained period of time. It is not unreasonable for a man who at 18 years of age is required by the state to lay down his life in defence of the polity to also have a vote. Women who are working in war industries, a role never imagined for women and viewed as somewhat unseemly in the day, were also granted a vote as they too were drawn into the total war vortex. Democracy had always been perceived as a system of government where only those who had the largest stake and thus the largest risk and responsibility should have a say in how the society or polity is run and managed. This was so throughout history, whether it be ancient Greece or ancient Rome and most of the forms of government in between. The Magna Carta type democracy that extended from medieval times through to the 1700s consisted of landowners and those aristocrats required to supply troops and tax revenue for the monarch. These were the people who had a say in government and matters of taxation. Over time, the pendulum of power would swing back and forth between monarch and aristocratic councils or parliaments, but was largely settled in Britain by 1688. The so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688 made clear the monarchy could only govern with the consent of the people as represented by Parliament, and all are subject to the law and none are above it. The first wave of democratic change associated with increasing the number of citizens entitled to vote and thus have a say in government came about as Western societies began moving from agrarian economies to industrial economies. This changeover cumulatively caused some changes in attitudes towards wider voting rights, and then later total war waged on an industrial scale radically changed this nexus. With the agricultural revolution, many people were displaced from the farmlands and moved to the developing industrial cities, a change which ushered in a new set of social dynamics and, importantly, separated wealth as being based on land agriculture more towards one of manufacturing and production. Moreover, this time of leaving the land largely severed what remained of the feudal relationship many had with the land, agriculture and the landlord, and this was a significant event in itself. Britain is possibly the best example of evolving democracy and so is used as a central example here. Technically, both France and the United States had universal adult male franchise from the 1780s and 1790s onwards, but this was largely in name only, and it was the 1850s before France, for example, sorted out their electoral system. As people moving from the farms from the late 1700s, and particularly so following the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, concentrated in the growing cities, so did the fear the aristocrats and the elites held for the mob, which was always an issue in Britain. There was always this fear that the elites had for the mob. With the potential for a mob to explode into violence, it made practical sense for the political establishment to broaden the franchise so as to include some of the newly developing wealthy industrial class, the manufacturers, who were employing all these workers. The process began in earnest during 1830, resulting in the 1832 Reform Bill, which expanded the franchise to about 30% of adult males, or around 650,000 voters from 400,000 voters, or about 21% of the adult male population at the time. Looking back now, this event may seem barely significant, but it set in train a sequence of events that led to substantially extended voting rights, and with it rewrote the rules of how the polity was perceived and how it functioned. Following the administrative reforms of 1867, almost two-thirds of adult males and some married women over the age of 30 gained a vote in 1885. This was probably about where democracy and voter civic participation would have stayed at its notional upper limit, other than window dressing type adjustments from time to time. Democracy was never meant to be an exercise in mass participation, and was never designed to bear such burdens of arbitration, sharing and expectation. Some would argue that 1885 was its high point. Those who contributed the most and achieved the most in a merit-based system, and importantly those who accepted responsibility for the health and functioning of the civis, had a say in government. Poor men and most women did not need or were unable to sufficiently contribute to or accept mutual obligations to society to justify receiving the vote, or so it was thought at the time. It is from herein that the critical turning point heading towards universal voting rights began to take shape, and its building blocks lumbered unseen and unknowing into position. These three critical forces running in parallel began to intertwine, from which was born our modern democracy. Chronological first was the developing trade union movement and its pursuit of political power by standing candidates in elections. As the trade union members, many of whom did not have the vote, could put forward candidates for parliament, candidates that they had elected within the union movement itself, this to some extent circumvented the restricted franchise, which permitted only 64% of adult men and 3% or so of married women to have the vote. Political unions were initially billed as the Labour Representation Committee, which later morphed into the Labour Party in Britain, drawing in large unions such as the railway unions, but also the Fabians and sundry adherents to the relatively new ideology of Marxism. It's the approximate equivalent of the Democrat Party in the United States. By 1906, the Labour Party had 29 members in Parliament. By 1924, the Party of Workers, the Labour Party, had actually formed government off the back of universal adult male suffrage. Rather than shake things up as one would expect a change of this magnitude might, the Labour Party primarily took votes away from the Whigs or the Liberals. Thus they effectively replaced them as the second major party. The political players had changed, but the status quo changed only moderately. The second strand was the rise of communism as a form of government, culminating in the Bolshevik seizure of power in Russia in 1917, and the belief that communism represented progress in human evolution. Many thinkers and firebrands and alleged intellectuals of the day openly pushed Marxism as being the next big thing. Total industrial war formed the third and most critical development leading to universal franchise. All able-bodied men and most women were all enlisted to serve the war effort. Many lost their lives, many others suffered horribly, and yet others withstood severe privations. And this is, of course, World War I and World War II. In what was a form of compensation for these specific sacrifices, all citizens over the age of 21 had the vote by 1929. What would be the consequences of giving the vote to so many citizens who divined their own imagined exploitation was itself an obligation already discharged? They had no further obligation to the civis, so many believed, and thus no particular obligation to democracy and its health. So could universal franchise democracy withstand such a test? By 1945, they also had the welfare state, or later on in the United States, the Great Society, which some believe was little more than a Cold War era bribe to Western citizens so as to ensure communism never took serious foothold. However, globalist policies are directly at odds today with the very notion of the democratic sovereign nation state, with a rule of law, due legal process, a free independent press and a scrupulously independent judiciary. It is unlikely that the two can meaningfully coexist. Today it is democracy that is on the run, while the authoritarianism essential to globalisation is on the ascendant. To enact the global vision, which can never be successfully sold to the Western public at large, has required a politicisation of the media and a comprehensive corruption of the public discourse. Buying off the executive branch and party machinery of the major political parties, politicising and corrupting the independence of law enforcement and judiciary, politicising the public service to the point of creating a set of deep state operatives, debasing codified laws and statutes, and reintroducing covert forms of arbitrary arrest. The cruel irony is that universal voting rights, in theory, when democracy reached its most dizzy heights, first brought celebration morphing into expectation, which in turn became division. Those who accept no responsibility for the health and well-being of the civis, or see responsibility as an optional extra, or even profess to hate the civis, will obviously not defend it. Yet today, these no responsibility, no obligation citizens have the vote, and they are more than a third of all voters, and they are playing directly into the hands of the globalists. Make no mistake, the battle today for public perception, the effort to entrench the one narrative of animus towards the civis, is a struggle for the survival of Western democracy. It is a battle already raging. Its battlegrounds are the propaganda of the media, the lies of the political class, the low IQ, angst-ridden transgender bathroom memes of cyberspace, the deep state politicisation of the public services and law enforcement. You've been with Tacitus Today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for watching.